I want you to imagine that you're at the end of a beautiful date with your partner, your lover, or if you haven't got either of those right now, the crush of your dreams. Things are getting hot and heavy and sensational, and you're about to take it to that next level. You're already in bed, you're rolling around, you're making out, you're stripping off your clothes, and suddenly they put their hand on your chest and pull back. They feel something cold, they feel something rigid, and they say, "Hey, why are you wearing this?" And you look down and you realize you're wearing a full medieval breastplate. No trousers, just the breastplate. You'd be shocked, right? Not only would you feel ridiculous, you would be utterly bamboozled, right? Why am I wearing a medieval breastplate all of a sudden? To make matters worse, not only is that rigidity and that suffocation from wearing any style of breastplate abundantly obvious in that moment, not only is the cold metallic contrast against your warm skin detracting from the intimacy that you could experience, it's actually many, many sizes too small. It's not an adult's armor, it's a child's armor. It's the armor that we put on long ago from the child armory, several sizes too small, and it's suffocating our chest wall, it's collapsing our rib cage, and it's keeping us bound in an artificial, rigid defense mechanism. In this episode of Inner Work Essentials, I want to unravel and illuminate the concept of emotional armor at a deeper level than is normally spoken about. Not only do I want to illustrate what emotional armor is, what are some of the signs and symptoms of if you might be wearing emotional armor, but I also want to link it into sexuality and a sense of dignity and self-love. Today's Inner Work Essential addresses this topic directly. It's by one of my favorite authors in the healing space, Alexander Lowen, a founder of Bioenergetics, and it's Love, Sex, and Your Heart by Alexander Lowen. This is the book that I'm focusing on for this episode of Inner Work Essentials, but I think episode 5 or episode 6, we looked at the voice of the body. I've got about 12 Alexander Lowen books in the library, and it's almost arbitrary that I've chosen this book for the topic of emotional armor because Lowen explores it in every book. But the reason that we're going with Love, Sex, and Your Heart is I want to try and illustrate how that breastplate that we're wearing is not only cutting off our sensation and keeping us trapped in rigidity under the illusion that we're safe and dignified, but I also want to show you how, because of that constriction, our sexuality is being heavily distorted, trapped in our genitals or trapped in our head, and lacks that engagement of the heart, which is what leads to things like projection, compulsion, addiction, or outright dysfunction. Let me lead with a quote from this book. Right at the end of the book, on page 198, Lowen's describing emotional armor and the difference between rigidity and dignity, which I think you'll find really illuminating. So, from the book. Dignity, the outward expression of self-esteem, is another ego value that keeps love rich. It brings a high degree of charge to the personality, which is attractive. Because the dignified individual holds himself proudly erect, many people confuse dignity with rigidity, but they are not the same. And this is the key point. The rigid person holds himself up out of a fear of breaking down. The dignified person has no fear of breaking down. He is neither stiff nor stuck up, nor is he unable to cry. His behavior merits our respect and promises that we will be, in turn, treated with respect. And then it goes on. This is a very heavily annotated page because, again, I highly recommend you read this book for yourself. Alexander Lowen then continues to explore this concept a little bit more, but he goes to the point about love and sexuality in a way which, again, I really want to float into your consciousness. He says, "Unfortunately, few of us have escaped the traumas of childhood, which forced us to isolate our hearts and armor ourselves against love. Still, we all yearn for love, though we cannot fully open our hearts until we feel secure." And he goes on to say, in essence, the only way to feel secure is to have love for ourselves. So how does emotional armor play into this concept of self-love, self-compassion, dignity, integrity, and the healing of our childhood traumas? In a nutshell, emotional armor, which is a neo-Reichian concept originally developed by Wilhelm Reich, an incredible and controversial psychologist in the 1930s, 1940s, indicates that we store emotions or have certain energetic, muscular defense mechanisms which store emotions inside of us or keep emotions locked around on traumatic loops, which are beneath our conscious awareness. They show up in things like posture, in things like voice, in things like subtle expression, all the many ways that we communicate unconsciously about the internal reality that we're experiencing. When it comes to emotional armoring with the breastplate variety, this is one side of the polarity of the spectrum of possible emotional defenses relating to abuse and transgression and unsafety in our childhood. The emotionally armored child, who we can imagine as maybe being ourselves, age 5 or age 10, is terrified. He goes into a certain imaginal room, he goes into a space where all the options of defense are available, he sees the shining golden breastplate, and in that moment where he's maybe being verbally, physically, or sexually assaulted, he's going to reach for that, or she's going to reach for that. It provides an actual sense of safety, because if we close off our hearts, if we put something here, the arrows can't go in, they bounce off. But of course we do restrict ourselves. The alternative defense mechanism, again on this spectrum of possible defenses, there's many spectrums, but this one particular spectrum is to dissolve completely. It's to consciously play the victim. It's more of a codependent pattern. It's more of a unconscious enmeshment where we Stockholm syndrome like blend with the abuser or the transgressive situation and completely dissolve our boundaries. One side is way too rigid, the other side is completely dissolved. If you're watching this video and you feel like you're actually far more towards the dissolved perspective, or maybe in certain relationships or certain situations you go one way or another way, I want you to know that it exists on this spectrum. Some signs that you might be wearing emotional armor, subtle, everyday signs that you're not actually activated in true receptivity. You can't receive compliments very well. You have sexual challenges in terms of intimacy and trust. Maybe you have a sense of desensitization, a sense of apathy or disengagement with your body. Most commonly, interestingly, see if you have this or have experienced this, if you are wearing a heavy emotional armor, and it was several sizes too small because you put it on when you were a kid, you exist here. So you've got choking in your throat, and you've got trapped energy here. And then below the armor at the waist, you've got liberation again. But it's not the kind of liberation of a free-flowing circuit. It's genital excitation and hypersensitivity, usually in a dysfunctional sense. This is one of the key energetic undercurrents behind pornography addiction. Head, neck, sudden suffocation, and then opening up at the genitals. So you have a broken chain, which is why young men especially can become so objectively focused on tits or asses or whatever they like, and just skip that heart-based stage of real intimacy, real human connection, and get lost in the pornographic fantasy again and again, because it's still better than nothing for the emotionally armored man. And the same with women as well. You'll experience a different version where women may get, it's more of a sexual healing pathway that I'm going on right now, but a lack of sensitivity in their breasts or a disengagement from their breasts, which some tantric schools would say is directly related to the heart for obvious reasons, a stiffening, a soreness, or at its very worst, breast cancer. Alexander Lowen in Love, Sex and Your Heart goes into cardiology as one of his main themes. He actually links emotional armoring to heart attacks, and he makes a very interesting case that, you won't believe this, heart doctors, cardiologists who spend their entire professional life dealing with issues of heart disease or heart attacks or any kind of heart-based problems actually suffer some of the most heart attacks of any profession in the world. It's almost like the healers who are trying to heal the thing which they're suffering from because they have incredibly stressful lives. They have so much emotional baggage that they're carrying from both their work and also the workload itself that they suffer the heart attacks which they're trying to cure. These two streams of heart problems and sexuality all come back to the same foundational pool, unfortunately, the polluted pool of unresolved childhood trauma. If that pool isn't titrated, if it isn't purified in one way or another, usually with a lot of somatic work, which I've covered in this series before, it will continue to flow indefinitely. The metaphors are getting maybe a little bit muddy in this sense, because how does water turn into armor? But I hope you get the point that I'm trying to illustrate. Emotional armor, again, to summarize, is something which we use as a defense mechanism to protect us from the hostilities of the world. It's one side of this spectrum, the other side being a codependent, artificial, pseudo-defenselessness, which we use to gain a sense of power. It's playing victim for a sense of empowerment. Very strange dynamic, but that's what it is. The emotional armor is the more deadening, rigidified version of that possible end route towards I want to feel safe and I want to feel empowered. So how do we get to a point of feeling safe, dignified, and empowered without the breastplate, without shutting off? That's really the question of healing in itself. Almost every single episode in this series, if you watched a few episodes back to back, or maybe you'll watch me for the first time, I have said the word safety, I think in every episode, because that is all it is. You don't need to put armor on your chest. You don't need to be in bed with your lover, or going to the grocery store, or sitting down reading a book with this heavy, tight breastplate on, unless a part of your mind, or a part of your heart, or a part of your nervous system more generally, remembers the war, remembers the conflict and the battles that you endured and that could happen at any moment. To get even more precise, you're going to wear that armor if there's an internal battle going on at the same time. It's almost like we can take the metaphor to another level, that it's not wearing a breastplate externally, it's almost sewn beneath our musculature. It's locked in, it's so imperceptible, and we're almost wrapping it around our heart itself. And of course there's going to be consequences. Of course, if we're artists or creatives, we're not going to be as sensitive as we could be to see the aesthetic wonder of the world and capture that with a heart-infused flair. Of course, if we're wearing the emotional armor, we're not going to be able to engage with the soft touch of our lover, or the ecstatic feeling of being kissed, or any sexual act if we're weighed down, constricted, and can't breathe. And of course, if we're working with screens every day, and we're dislocating our consciousness to live inside of a glowing rectangle, and we're already feeling trapped in, and like we exist from the neck up, and the cock or the vagina downwards, we're just going to be these strange, fragmented creatures perpetually, unless we resolve the core issue, which again is childhood unsafety. I wish it wasn't this intense, but my personal experience of taking off this armor and opening up my heart as a man has been so transformative. Women generally know how to do this better, and interestingly, I think because women, this is just a pet theory of mine, because women are more likely to apply massage lotions or skincare products, they'll give themselves full body massages. They make far more contact with their chest and their heart area in terms of touch than men ever will. So imagine if you're a man, to get to the point where you give yourself chest massages, something I do very frequently in very small ways at this point. It was initially quite an intentional practice to revitalize my chest, but now I'll be walking back from the gym, down a main street, cars going past me, and I'll just do this. No one would know. Obviously I can get away with it as a man, socially it's not okay for a woman to be giving herself a breast massage in public, and maybe it's something that we'd, skillfully not do. But the concept is illuminating. It's applying healing touch, compassionate touch to ourselves in a way that reconditions our nervous system and proves that the safety is there and that we are the safe, self-loving container who need not wear the armor. There's a lot of work to be done here. Start with the somatic work. There's sexual healing work as well. There's relational work too. But in a nutshell, and in conclusion, the only way to step out of emotional armor without shifting too dramatically and unconsciously towards complete dissolution, maybe artificial spiritual bypassing, ultimate surrender, absolute bliss, non-dualistic, well, not real non-dualism, but pseudo-non-dualistic flight away from pain. The way to not get straight towards that and trade one dysfunction for another dysfunction is to walk the middle ground of daily practice. And to walk the middle ground requires our feet being on the ground, and it requires showing up for ourselves in the way that we weren't cared for when we were children. Which means everyday practice, it means everyday care, and it means recognizing that tightness when it's happening and choosing to open it up every time. Choosing to breathe, choosing to feel, choosing to be in the world with an open heart, knowing when we need to put the armor on for maybe a certain conflict, knowing that we create wider boundaries, a fortress-like defense sometimes for people who really we don't want to let in, but ultimately the vision of a citadel which has a permeable drawbridge which we let people in, and that serves as the defense at a further degree away from the defense that we need to wear on our chest. That metaphor is so alive, right? Imagine being the king or queen in your kingdom or queendom. You're not going to wear the armor all the time. You've got different guards. You've got different systems in place. You've got treaties and alliances. That's the inner working element. If you want to go further in this work, then I'd recommend that we take the next steps together into real nervous system rewiring, and this is the time to bring in some more neuroscience, some brain science, some attachment theory, and essentially learn how the body bears the burden, which conveniently enough is the next episode in this series, and I can't wait to share it with you. I'll see you over there.